Hello, everyone. I just wanted to take this second class to talk about a few economic measures that we'll be referring to throughout the course. We'll talk about what each of them mean, take a look at what they how they've evolved over time and what they're at today, and also maybe talk a little bit about why we should care about them. So, that's the plan for today, just go through measure by measure and talk about it. Just a little bit of background. Large-scale national level economic statistics were not really a thing until about the 1930s with the Great Depression. The new dealers kind of wanted to see what the effects of their interventions were, and they needed some way to measure that, and so measurement of GDP became a much larger priority than it would have been, 5-10 years before then. And this practice of gathering large-scale national-level economic statistics like GDP, unemployment rates, things like that quickly spread to other countries after the Second World War. The UK also did a lot of measurement during the war. And today we've just got innumerable different economic measures to choose from. But we're going to start with GDP, because I think that's kind of the most familiar one. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total value of all goods and services produced within the borders of a country over a particular period of time. It's usually measured over a year or a quarter. Importantly, we only care about the value of final goods and services. So, for instance, if, there's a shoe that's made and that's the final good, the leather that went into that shoe would be considered an intermediary good. And we wouldn't want to count the value of that leather. In practice, it's very difficult to define what is and isn't a final good. And so the method that economists have developed over time is to calculate the value added at each step of the process. So, for instance, there's a certain value created by the person that raises the cow. There's a value created when the person tans the leather, and then when it's made into the shoe, right? And so we measure the value at each step in this process. There are certain things that GDP does not measure. For instance, household production is kind of the huge one, right? Childcare, cooking meals for yourself, cleaning, those things are not measured in GDP. Some non-governmental calculations of the value of that by attaching kind of market value for like childcare and cleaning to those activities has estimated that it could be as much as 30% of GDP. I believe that 30% figure was for the United Kingdom, with kind of the lower measures being around 12%. So it's a substantial chunk of the economy that is completely not measured in GDP. Informal and illegal economic activity is also not part of GDP, right? So people that are being paid under the table, day laborers, for instance, and also people selling illegal goods, right? Like none of that's going to be measured in GDP. It's also important to remember that GDP doesn't measure secondary sales. So this could be like a used car, this could be just buying something on KSL, things like that. That's just moving things around, nothing new is produced, right? So that's not part of GDP. Importantly, stocks are also a secondary sale because the firm issues the stock and then it's just swapped around in the stock market. And so those are all secondary sales, also not measured in GDP. There are some things that are measured in GDP, but they're kind of difficult to measure directly, so we have to kind of guess. One of these that's most relevant in kind of developed nations is housing services. So if you own your own home, then you enjoy a flow of housing services from your ownership of the home. And those are being produced each year in our construction of GDP. And so we need to attach some sort of price to those, even though you're not actually paying that price, right? And so typically what is done is they look at fair market rents in kind of the locality around where that home is, and they attach those market values to the flow of housing services, and they annualize it to add that up to GDP. More important for developing nations is imputing the value of subsistence farming, right? Because subsistence farmers are not selling their goods and services in a market, they're just consuming them directly. But this is a huge chunk of the economic activity of some developing nations. And so we want to attach some value to that as well. And so once again, they look for what the value of the commodities being produced are in markets, and then they attach that value to the good that never enters a market. Just to kind of give you an idea of scale, I believe these figures are a few years old, but this diagram shows kind of global GDP with it carved up by continent and by country. Here, for instance, in this year, the United States creates about 24.4% of global GDP, and various other economies mixed in there. I believe as of last year or the year before last, China's total GDP was larger than the United States, becoming the largest economy in the world. Now, knowing the scale of a country's complete economic activity is a useful measure in and of itself, but it doesn't really get us down to something that we might care about more, which is, what are people's lives actually like? What are their living standards? And so we kind of do a two-step process to get to that. First is we divide GDP by population, so we get per capita GDP. And another way of phrasing this is economic output per person. And this gets us closer to it and is fine for looking at one country in 1 year. But we'd really like to be able to look at how that changes over the years. And so one way that we do that is we adjust it for inflation. And this goes from what we've been talking about so far as nominal GDP to real GDP, or GDP adjusted for inflation. And typically this is done by looking at a bundle of goods that most people consume and look at how the price of that bundle has changed from year 1 to year 2. And in the US, the most popular one is the Consumer Price Index, CPI. And we use how the prices of that bundles of goods has changed from year to year to essentially allow us to make comparisons between GDP values for different years. So just like how adjusting GDP for inflation lets us make comparisons within one country over time, we run into problems whenever we try to compare the GDP per capita values of different countries, because different countries have different price levels. And so the way that we make that adjustment is with a similar sort of measure called purchasing power parity. And so, once again, we take a bundle of goods, we look at how much it costs in country A, and then we look at how much it costs in country B, and then we normalize it such that each unit of GDP, be it international dollars or what have you, could buy the same amount of goods in each country. So, GDP is, in theory, equal to GNI, or gross national income. But in practice, there are some transactions that straddle between years, and so there's going to be some statistical discrepancy between the two. But it's also important to note that even though we say GDP more frequently, typically we are using an income approach to calculate it in most countries. Also here, just want to briefly mention gross national product, which rather than looking at the borders of a country, gross national product looks at the productivity of citizens of a country, but it's a similar measure that can be adjusted in all the same ways: per capita, for inflation, and purchasing power parity. So the next few graphs are meant to kind of give you an idea of the scale of differences of per capita real GDP. So these are all adjusted for inflation and for differences in price levels between countries. And these are the countries that are kind of nearer the top This is not like a pure ranking list. Norway out there at around 65,000 current international dollars a year. U.S. somewhat below. Netherlands, New Zealand, and Korea. I wanted to get kind of a geographical spread. Here's a bundle of countries that would constitute kind of your middle income countries. So these are all relatively rich countries. These are kind of middle income countries. Chile up above 24,000 a year, all the way down to India and Bangladesh. Bangladesh being at the bottom here with just over 4,000 a year. Now, here, so remember, these are like middle income countries. Rwanda and Liberia are among the poorest countries on the planet. And the OECD member average GDP that I have in that top bar there, that kind of represents the average income among the kind of richer countries. So average income among the richer countries is more than, what is that? More than 18, almost 19 times more than it is in Rwanda. And far more times over Liberia. So this gives you an idea of the pure spread between the poorest and the richest countries globally. So moving on from that, I would like to talk about labor market measures. So this kind of elaborate flowchart here describes which people are in and who are not in the labor force. So we've got the civilian non-institutional population, 16 or older, which basically just means people that aren't in prison or in some sort of other institution. Those are broadly split into people who are working or not working. Working people are employed and part of the labor force. If you're not working, there's being absent from the job, on layoff, or actively looking for work, and all of those put you into unemployed, also in the labor force. But if none of those three apply, none of the above, not in the labor force. So we look at the people who are in the labor force to calculate the unemployment rate. So for instance, if you are in prison or you are not working because you simply choose not to work, you're not in the labor force and you don't count as unemployed. But we don't have just one measure of unemployment. So the narrowest measure of unemployment is U1, which is people that are unemployed for 15 weeks or more. U2 has people that just lost their job for whatever reason, or have completed temporary work. U3, which is the typical measure that is used, which is, when you hear on the radio or on TV, the unemployment rate was 6% last month or whatever. That's usually U3. And that consists of people that are without a job and have looked for work within the last 4 weeks. Especially with the slow recovery from the 2008 recession, the broader measures became more important. For instance, U4 is U3 plus all discouraged workers. Those are people that have given up looking for work. U5 includes marginally attached workers. These are workers with temporary contracts. They are also kind of lumped in with the unemployed. And finally, U6 is the broadest measure that also includes people who are underemployed. People who are underemployed are people who would like to work, say, full-time, but cannot get to full-time hours. And so in this way, they kind of all nest within one another, these different unemployment measures. This graph shows the U.S. unemployment rate over time, and it shows it for each of these different kind of measures of broadness. So there's, as we all know, there's probably a significant spike subsequent to this graph with all the COVID stuff going on. But we can see that the distance between the different measures of unemployment changes over time. And so, for instance, whenever a recession lasts quite a long time, so if we look around kind of the 2008 recession, the unemployment rate by all measures spikes. But until deep into the recession, they're all pretty close together, and so it takes time for people to become discouraged workers, for instance, or underemployed workers. And so it just kind of spreads over time, and we need to kind of keep in mind that there are these different ways of looking at unemployment that have different implications. For instance, if we are looking at short-term fluctuations, U3 might be a really good measure. But if we're looking at kind of longer-term or situations where people may need to go through a bunch of reskilling to kind of adapt to a new economic reality, measures like U4 and U5 become more relevant. Another labor market measure that we can think about is the unionization rate. So the unionization rate is just, we take the number of union members and we divide that by total employed workers. And this chart shows the unionization rate in the US from 1930 to a little after 2002. And we can see that we've got this kind of rapid increase in the war and post-war years, relatively stable in the 50s and 60s, with the slide beginning in the 70s. And now the unionization rate sits down around 10% presently, which is a little bit off this graph, but it's been continually slowly declining since. We might care about the unionization rate because union members tend to make higher wages. And in sectors that are heavily unionized, that tends to have an effect even on the wages of non-unionized workers. So for instance, non-union dock workers receive higher wages simply by fact that the Longshoremen's Association exists and raises the pay scale for the whole industry. So, stepping away from labor market measures for a moment, we also probably care about poverty, right? So poverty measures are fairly complicated. The poverty line is calculated based on a bundle of goods and services that people think, or that government agencies believe people need to continue to kind of exist. And then they look at how the price of that bundle of goods changes over time, and they adjust the poverty line, which is an income threshold, based upon how the value of those goods and services change over time. The current U.S. poverty line for a single person under 65 is $11,770 a year. For a family of 4 with 2 children, it's $24,250 a year. So in either case, not a princely sum. Using those poverty lines that change based on household size, the poverty rate in the U.S. was about 12.3% in 2017. The international poverty line is calculated far differently, but it does have a similar basis in a bundle of goods. The international poverty line is $1.90 a day, and this line is just meant to indicate extreme poverty. And so that equates to about $694 a year. Now, this isn't the only way that you can measure poverty. The supplemental poverty measure is a more broad measure that takes into account government benefits received, but also differences in cost of living based on location. The U.S. calculates this one as well, and I've got it on this graph here. So, for instance, the official poverty measure as of 2015 sits around, what is that, about 13%? And the supplemental poverty measure places it somewhat above that. In this graph, we also have people that are below half of the threshold charted as well, which is sitting at about 6% in 2015. So, And I think it's pretty straightforward why we care about poverty measures, right? Just material deprivation is not good for individuals, but also not good socially. And we'll talk about that more whenever we get to that class. A kind of adjacent concept to poverty is inequality, right? So poverty is this absolute measure based upon this income threshold. Inequality is a relative measure that looks at the distribution of income between individuals. The most common measure for inequality is the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of personal income distribution, and it ranges from 1, which is maximum inequality, to 0, perfect equality. It doesn't tell us everything, though, and the same value may be assigned to very different looking curves. But the way that we get to that number is we make what's called a Lorenz curve. So on this graph, imagine you're lining up every person in a country from lowest income to highest income. And then we sum up each person's income as we move from left to right. So this is a cumulative distribution as we move from left to right. And so what we do is we take the area that's shaded yellow here and we divide it by the total area under that 45-degree line, under that perfect equity distribution line. And that gives us a number between 0 and 1. Remembering that 1 is unequal, 0 is more equal. So here's a list of countries with their corresponding Gini coefficients. The years vary here because not every country collects it every year. But the U.S. is more unequal than, say, China. South Africa is far more unequal than either the U.S. or China. The Ukraine is quite equal at 0.26. France also quite equal at 0.32. And so there's quite a range on these numbers, right? So just in this small smattering of countries, we see it ranging from 0.26 in Ukraine to 0.63 in South Africa. A different way to look at inequality is to look not at a personal income distribution, but a functional income distribution. And we can do that by looking at the wage share. And so the idea here is we look at the incomes of one group of people that serve a function in the economy, workers who provide labor, and we take that as a ratio to total income. So total incomes earned by workers divided by all incomes earned in an economy. And we can look at how the workers' wage share changes over time. And so in this graph from 1947 to 2016, you can see that there's this kind of oscillation, but by and large a downward trend in the wage share in the US. And so this tells us that workers are not receiving raises over the years, right? They're not receiving the gains of increased productivity. Those gains are going to people that own capital instead, right? And so they serve a very different function in the economy. So that's kind of two ways of thinking about income distribution. One in this functional sense, based on what people do in the economy, and one in this personal sense where it just lines people up based on their individual incomes. We've been pretty close to the ground here in terms of looking at incomes and shares and specific statuses, but that doesn't give us a full picture of what people's economic lives are like. And so we'll talk more in depth about broader measures of economic well-being next week, but one that's particularly relevant for developing countries is the Human Development Index. And the idea of the Human Development Index is that it takes a more kind of broad view of what, we want humans' lives to look like, and it creates this index from 0 to 1 that weights them. So the HDI takes in a few different measures. It takes in life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, standard of living measured by gross national income per capita and adjusted for purchasing power parity. So it takes those three measures and it weights them together and scales them from 0 to 1. And so it's really great for looking at relative differences between countries because we use consistent weighting between those three measures across all countries. And this map shows about what you would expect, right? Europe and its offshoots are much more developed by HDI measure than South American, African, and Southeast Asian countries, right? So it's kind of verifying what we may already have an inkling of. One important note about indices like this is that they're somewhat subjective. Somebody has to make a decision of what the relative valuing is between life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, and per capita GDP. And so there is some subjectivity in like what the multipliers between those are. So always keep that in mind. And whenever you're using an indice for some purpose, it's often a really good idea to look in specifically what is included in the indice and how the people that constructed it chose to weight the different elements of it. So just to keep in mind. So let's turn to a few more kind of demographic measures. Something that you probably hear about often are pay gaps, right? Gender or racial pay gaps. And it seems kind of straightforward, right? Like, look at how much, men are being paid, look how much women are being paid for equivalent work, see what the difference is. And that's one way of doing it, and that's one way that is often pursued. That's the uncontrolled wage gap. We just look at the differences in pay between two different groups. Could be men and women, could be white people and black people. They're very different. We could construct a similar kind of gap measure for any demographic group we care to. I've even seen age pay gaps. But that gives us a really incomplete picture because in the instance of, say, the gender pay gap, part of that is because there's a difference in occupational choice. And so in aggregate, women are paid less than men, but women also self-select into different careers and work different hours. Now, there are tons of background reasons that we'll talk about why that is the case and why simply that occupational choice may itself be evidence of discrimination. But we'll set that aside for a moment. So one way to deal with that issue is to control for other factors. So they'll use regression analysis and they will control for job tenure, they'll control for education, and various other kind of measures of productivity. And whenever you include those other elements, the pay gap shrinks. Now, once again, just like with our discussion of indices, what bundle of control variables you include there is somewhat subjective. There's some that are clearly need to be in there, like job tenure, but others are probably more arguable. And so controlled gender pay gaps or controlled racial pay gaps have some subjective element to them as well. And so, once again, if you're using a controlled pay gap, it is important to figure out what is being controlled for. And so these, what you see here are uncontrolled and controlled for pay gaps for the U.S. I believe this was in 2018. And we can see that it's 79 cents on the dollar uncontrolled, 98 cents on the dollar controlled. But this site was not particularly transparent in what they're controlling for, so keep that in mind. We may also care about ages and age as a demographic. So here is a population pyramid where we can kind of see the current, what might be called the millennial generation bump as we get kind of taller bars around 25 to 29. And then there's also a bump higher up that's the baby boomers. And these sorts of graphs have important implications for sectoral considerations in the economy. For instance, if you've got a large population of elderly people, that means that you're probably going to have a lot of spending on your healthcare sector in the future. And so these are things that we should also keep in mind. We also hear about trade deficits a lot. Trade deficits are simply whenever your net exports are negative, whenever you buy more things from other countries than you export to other countries. And here's the U.S. trade deficit over time. We can see that the trade deficit actually, the goods and services balance being the relevant line here, has actually shrunk since 2005 quite substantially, and seems to be leveling off around negative 3% of GDP around 2015. And here it's also kind of important to note the U.S. is a net exporter in services, but a net importer in goods. And so it's a multifaceted measure in and of itself. I alluded to it earlier with the Consumer Price Index discussion for weighting GDP. But just kind of looking at it more specifically here, this graph shows the Consumer Price Index from about 1920 to 2015, I believe. And so the blue line charts what the price of that bundles of goods that we talked about earlier is over time. And we here it is based in the year over the average period of 1982 to 1984. And so we can see that prices generally rise over time, so that bundle of goods becomes more expensive over time. The red line shows the percent change in the value of that CPI between years. And so that's what we conventionally think of as our inflation rate. You can see that inflation was far more volatile in the before 1970. Let's go 1960. Far more volatile after 1960 than it was after. Far more volatile before 1960 than after 1960. With you can kind of see the whole stagflation bit in the middle of the 1970s there as well. And price level is measured by the Consumer Price Index is an important part of the health of an economy. Because if prices are continually rising, people are going to spend their money as quickly as possible. But if, instead we have deflation, prices are falling, people are going to hold on to their money because it'll be worth more if they wait a week, right? Deflation is actually far more damaging to an economy than inflation, but we'll talk about that in more detail later. So I just wanted to run through a few measures that I'm going to talk about throughout the course so you have an idea of what's going on before then. But I think the big takeaway here is that measurement is difficult in the social sciences. We use a bunch of different measures to get kind of a more complete picture about what the economy is actually doing. GDP and its offshoots are not enough. We need poverty measures. We need racial pay gaps. We need inflation rates. We need to look at all of these different aspects of it. And so next class, we're going to talk about a broad class of measures that try to get a better reflection of what human economic life is actually like and capture that in some form of index. All right, well, I think that's all I got, and thanks.